the same time, I'm also an advocate, and I support the Palestinian struggle. And I hope I won't have to do that tonight. And I will explain why. I'm very happy that you're organizing this important event. I think the connections between Palestine and Syria are many, as I will try to suggest tonight. And I don't think we can really understand the Syrian revolt, the Syrian uprising, without understanding its profound and multi-layered and complex connections with the struggle in Palestine. The irony is, when you talk about Palestine, at least from a Syrian standpoint, is there is this almost like dual move. On the one hand, Palestine has been a source of inspiration for Syrians and Arabs in general, and people have always been very much inspired and supported the Palestinian struggle, and have denounced the deep injustice that the Palestinians were going through. And so this is a very important source of inspiration for the Arab revolts, for the Syrian uprising. And I don't think we can really understand the Syrian resistance, the Syrian struggle for liberation, without understanding the impact of the Palestinian struggle on Syria and the Arab world in general. On the other hand, the Arab regimes, including the Syrian regime, have utilized Palestine in order to quell any quest for democracy in the Arab world. So the Syrian regime has often made that argument that any kind of demands about democracy or social justice or economic justice should be postponed until we liberate Palestine. And we shouldn't talk about anything but Palestine. And all the resources in Syria, including oil and other things, should be utilized to build and to prepare for the war against the Zionist entity. And the other irony is that one of the most important torture centers in Syria is called the Palestine branch. That's an infamous center. Anyone from Syria will tell you many narratives and story about that center. It's mostly underground. Many Palestinians, many Syrians and Arabs have been tortured there. Many people have been killed in that center. So again, it's interesting to see how the Syrian official narrative around around Palestine is deployed. And so what I want to do today is basically use these 10-15 minutes to propose a number of tools, theoretical tools, to help us understand the Syrian revolt, the Arab revolutions, and their connections to Palestine. And so I'm proposing here 5 different political theoretical tools. And I think they're important to deploy and to utilize to be able to understand what's happening. I think one of the pitfalls, one of the failures in people writing and talking about Syria, about the Arab world, is that oftentimes they have a tendency to use old political tools, old conceptual framework to understand something that's really new. So the first tool is the colonial question, and I'm going to explain why this is important. And I think that we should go back to Franz Fanon to really understand the colonial dimension of what's happening right now in the Arab world, in Syria and Palestine. The second dimension is Orientalism, going back to the work of Edward Said. The third is a question of scale. So what scale to actualize, and why is that important? So scale is, for example, why what's happening at the level of a village or a town is different from what's happening at the level of a nation state or a region, and so on. Fourthly, the question of representation, political representation, in the case of Syria, Palestine, and elsewhere. And finally, I'll talk about the crisis of the nation state, and why that's almost like an obsolete framework to try to understand what's happening in Syria and Palestine. So let's start with the colonial question. One of the interesting things, is that, at least for me and many others, in order to understand what's happening in Syria, I think we have to go back to the work of Frantz Fanon and other post-colonial thinkers. What's happening in the Arab region is a process of decolonization in many ways. You won't hear many people talking about that and referring to that kind of language. But Frantz Fanon suggested in the 1950s, when he was talking about the Algerian revolt and the African revolts, and he was part of that. And I think Fanon's writing is really interesting in that sense because it's a decolonial writing. It's a writing that should be understood as political, as activist, as part of what's happening. It's not outside, it's not descriptive after the fact. It's part of a process, the decolonial process. So what Fanon suggested is that the military colonization of Africa and the Middle East has become really costly, ineffective. And therefore, the colonial powers, Europe and the West, should look for innovative new ways to pursue their colonial power. And they have done so by basically replacing themselves by the natives and the colonial bourgeoisie. And so the colonial bourgeoisie played a central role after decolonization, after independence. And that took a number of different dimensions, economic, political, social, and so on. So the national bourgeoisie became almost like a middleman between Europe, the West, and the native populations. And they played a central role in pursuing and maintaining this relationship of domination and hegemony between Europe and the rest, the global South. And one of the most important tools that has been utilized in order to maintain that relationship of domination between Europe and the global South is debt. Just to give you an example, for every dollar that the global South has borrowed from the West, they paid back $11. So, I mean, you see how military colonization has been completely replaced by this very unjust economic relationship. And all the Arab regimes have played a central role in maintaining that relationship of domination. What some people call neo-colonization, a form of colonization that doesn't require military presence in that region. And therefore, we should think about the Arab Revolution and Arab region and what's happening in that region as a process of decolonization. Decolonization not of the land, because that's being done in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, but the decolonization of politics. So it's a decolonial process when it comes to politics, society, economics, and even our way of being. So so that's a difficult process, decolonizing our being, but it's something that's happening. So for example, when you hear people talking about the Syrian revolution, and I talked to many people, I interviewed many people since 2011 to 2014. I was initially going to Damascus, and then later on I was going to the northern areas in Syria. Through the Turkish borders. I stopped going to Damascus because I felt that I might be arrested or something. I was active in Europe and in the US, so I stopped going to Damascus, but I was going through the Turkish borders. And so when you hear people talking about what's going on, why are they protesting, why are they willing to sacrifice their life, it's really a process of decolonization of their own being, of who they are as humans. And this idea of breaking the silence and hearing their own voice for the first time, protesting and saying slogans against Assad, against Arab dictatorship and so on. And that's really a process of emancipation that you can't really describe. You have to live it, to experience it. So that's what I mean by the process of decolonization of one's being, of the economy, of society, of politics. It's going on in all these different areas. And I think this is why it's important to go back to Fanon, Frantz Fanon, the important Martinican scholar, intellectual, organic intellectual, was not only an intellectual but also an activist, political activist against racism, against colonization, against white supremacy, and so on, to understand really what's happening in the Arab region. Because the Arab decolonization was in many ways aborted in the 1950s and 60s, and now we are seeing this re-emergence, a process of decolonization that hopefully will reach its own end if what we're seeing in the Arab region still goes on. So that's the first tool that I'm proposing, trying to understand what's happening in the Arab region in Syria as a process of decolonization. It's not simply an uprising or a revolt against dictatorship. It's a process of decolonization, of delinking from the West, of finally becoming independent, and finally have a say of what goes on in your own economy, in your own politics and society. The second process is Orientalism. These revolts, unfortunately, for the most part, have been understood through the Orientalist mindset. And there are three main themes that you hear over and over again. If you tune in, and you read the New York Times, and the CNN, any of these mainstream, media, and those are, first of all, Islam and political Islam. It's not really, a revolt. It's not really an uprising. It's not really a social movement against dictatorship. It's political Islam. It's ISIS. It's the jihadi, and so on. And therefore, what's happening in the Arab region is reduced to this image of the savage, the violent Arab other or Muslim other that is not really thinking, that is basically trying to deploy a medieval thinking from the 13th or 11th century, and so on and so forth. The second dimension is women liberation. And by the way, this is really interesting because if you go back to the colonial enterprise in the 19th century, 20th century, with Britain and France, all these themes are also deployed. So for example, when France tried to justify its colonization of Algeria, it utilized those same themes. Islam, we need to civilize them. The Muslims are savages in some ways. We need to liberate their women. Their women are oppressed. These Arab men are, violent and oppressive and patriarchal. And so the question of women has been central in those Arab revolts. And I will mention just, a few examples of how complex the question of women is in the Arab region and the Arab revolts. So for example, ISIS has a women militia in Raqqa and Mosul. Those women are obviously very oppressive. When they, identify someone who's involved with the revolution, they go to torture chambers and they are killed. The Syrian regime has women brigades who are, savages. They kill people. They are snipers and so on and so forth. In a different context, the Kurdish groups have utilized women in order to sell their narrative to the West. So oftentimes when you hear about, Kurds, you hear about the women fighters, the women spokespersons, or and so on. And I think, I'm for the Kurdish self-determination and so on. But I think that the Kurds have utilized this Orientalist narrative to sell, a very just cause, and have put their women in the forefront to basically say that they are surrounded by ISIS savages, and there are those islands of secular, progressive, feminist, groups, and so on. When in fact, anyone who has any understanding and knowledge about the region, Kurds and Arabs are really the same. I mean, Kurds are not more feminist than Arabs. They come from the same cultures and so on, and they have a lot in common. But this discourse about feminism has been utilized and deployed by some Kurdish groups to basically sell, the Kurdish struggle on a global level. And finally, the question of violence. That people in that region, they're not familiar with democracy. They can't use, political tools. What they can do is basically militarize and use violence. They're aggressive. You hear talk about the Arab street, the Muslim street. The individual is basically erased, is silenced, and you see masses of angry people. And you're not sure what they want, and they are irrational, they're not logical, they're just violent, and they want to get rid of those despots. But you almost like sympathize with those despots when you hear that Orientalist discourse. So again, this Orientalist discourse has three dimensions. The aggressive, violent Arabs and Muslims, political Islam, and the way the Arab revolts have been presented and reduced to their Islamic dimension, and the question of women, and the need to liberate women. And what's interesting, and the irony you hear sometimes in the West, is so many patriarchal people in the political sphere talking about women's rights in the West, in the East, or in Syria and in the Arab region, when they are against those same rights in the West, in the US, in Europe. Bill O'Reilly and many others. I won't give examples, but I'm sure that you've heard that argument by Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, some of the most conservatives here in the US, talking about women's rights and how Arabs treat their women, and when we know what they think about women here in the West. So the third question is a question of scale. And here, I think one of the problems with Syria is that oftentimes it has been reduced to one dimension. And instead, I want to propose overlapping maps to understand what's happening in Syria. There is complexity. There is, on the one hand, the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. On the other, there is the confrontation between Russia and the US. The third dimension is the Shia and Sunni conflict. There is tension, obviously, between the Kurds and the Turks. And all of these different narratives and stories and overlapping maps have basically silenced the Syrian Revolution. The Syrian Revolution is not on those maps. And what I want to propose instead is that we utilize micropolitics as a tool to be able to unearth and make the revolution visible. And so micropolitics is about what people do on an everyday basis. So what I observed, for example, in a city like Manbij, how they were able to recreate some institution and discourses and stories to make their cities and villages livable despite the bombing and despite the violence of the Syrian regime. Against macro politics and reducing everything that's happening in the Arab region as simply confrontation of different nation states, state interests, and so on, and so on. Finally, the last question I will, the last dimension I will mention is the question of the nation state. And I think the nation state is still with us, but it's also in crisis. And what I mean by that is that we need to rethink the nation state as an organizing framework. The nation state should be revisited because many of the Syrians are right now in diaspora. Many of the Palestinians are in diaspora. They're not part of the nation state as we understand it usually. And so we need to come up with new ways to understand population and migration and flows of citizens throughout those regions in a new way. In addition to that, ISIS has dismantled the borders between Iraq and Syria. And they have made a very good argument, and I agree with their argument, that those borders are inherited from the Sykes-Picot, that the colonial powers drew those borders in 1919, 1920, and we are living with them. Those borders are extremely violent. Bedouins on both sides of the border in Syria, Jordan, and elsewhere still cross them, even today. People are still there are marriages between people on both sides of the borders and so on. So we need to think about ways to transcend this idea of the nation state. activists and organizers in Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Syria are connected in so many different ways through various networks, through social media and otherwise. And so the nation state is obviously problematic. And we can't just simply reduce those Arab words, Syria, Palestine, simply to the nation state as we knew it in the past. One of the things I want to propose, and we'll end here, is Bilad Sham as a new framework that I think could be really productive to think what's happening in the Levant. Bilad Sham is the Levant. It's all these different countries, including Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, that people are proposing as an alternative. So, for example, if you talk to people in Syria, they'll talk about Bilad Sham this, Bilad Sham that, and same thing with Jordan and Palestine. And this is, a practical way to, rethink and challenge some of the old frameworks and help us understand what's happening in the region in really new and productive ways. Thank you.
Okay, you might be facing the board if that's okay. Okay.
Can you hear us?
In here. Should we have him go last?
We're all set.
Oh. Yeah, we can hear you now, but.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. All right.
Is it fun?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, should I go? So it's a bit weird that I'm facing a mathematic. First time I do this, so bear with me, please. No, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for this panel. It's great. It's a great subject and very much needed. I will continue on the same line of Yasser. I nearly agree with everything he said, and I will act my intervention on three main points that he asked me to speak. the myth of Assad anti-imperialism, views of Israel, of the revolutionary processes in the Middle East and North Africa, and about the popular organization still existing within Syria, and despite everything, still organizing people against the various threats that are facing the uprising, whether the Assad regime and its allies, various imperialist forces, and Islamic fundamentalist forces. So let's start. First, I would like to say I totally agree with Yasser when he talks about focus on geopolitical analysis when it comes to Syria. It's been a main problem for huge sections of observers and even among various sectors of the left. On the opposite, we should always analyze the dynamics from below. And this is why, before showing the anti-imperialism of the Assad regime, I would just like to say that when we analyze a state or political actor, we don't start by analyzing its foreign policies. Otherwise, we could consider a various state as if being anti-American characteristic of anti-imperialism. Therefore, Al-Qaeda would be a fantastic anti-imperialist organization, which is definitely not. So in the case of Syria, obviously the state was oppressive against the popular classes, was serving the interest of a tiny crony capitalist class, and were against, obviously, as I said, the popular classes, etc. And there's various history of neoliberal policies implemented under the Assad regime, especially among Bashar al-Assad. And anti-labor laws that has been ongoing for the past 4 decades, repression of leftist forces, trade unions, independent unions, etc. But when it comes, let's have a CP to the, let's observe the policies of the Assad regime since the father of Bashar al-Assad took power in 1970, Hafiz al-Assad. Just to say that before he took power, Hafiz al-Assad, when he was Minister of Defense in 1970, he refused, even though the head of state at the time in Syria in 1970, Salah Jadid, he refused to go help the Palestinians and progressive forces in Jordan during Black September, when the Hashemite kingdom repressed the Palestinian and progressive uprising in Jordan to overthrow the regime. Hafiz al-Assad refused to send any kind of military help to the Palestinian progressive forces. Following this, he took power, and since then he had a policy just to further the interest of the Assad regime, basically. And this has been the case in foreign policy as well. The first example was with the Lebanese civil war. The Assad regime intervened in Lebanon on the side of the conservative and reactionary forces of Lebanon, the Kata'ib, the various, what we used to call the Christian conservative camp, against the Palestinian and progressive forces of Lebanon. And the Assad regime participated in the slaughter of Tel Za'atar camp in 1976 in Lebanon. That was made by Kata'ib, but was made possible by the Assad regime. And they crushed the Palestinian and progressive forces of Lebanon. Following this, in the 80s, at few occasions, the Assad regime supported political groups such as Harakat Amal, for example, in the war of the camps against the Palestinians. And again, in the 80s, it was very important when Israel in Lebanon, South Lebanon in 78, but they came back in 82, Israel, and the siege of Beirut, etc. But what happened, there was a progressive national resistance established by various progressive and nationalist parties in Lebanon, which was called the Lebanese National Revolutionary Front. And this front was progressively attacked by the Assad regime and its allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah or Harakat Amal. They didn't want any kind of progressive resistance, unsectarian, that was not controlled by the Assad regime. Therefore, progressively this force was whipped out of Lebanon, despite having made great victories against Israel. Instead of it, Hezbollah became the main resistant force, but a sectarian resistance force that could not unite the whole Lebanese people. And secondly, that was occurred in the hand of the Assad regime in the various peace negotiations of the Assad regime with Israel. Because we have to know that since '74, not a single bullet was shot against Israel until 2011. Various times the Assad regime tried to make a peace with Israel, but it was not because Assad regime didn't want to do peace with Israel. It was Israel unwilling to do peace with Syria that no peace was made. And not a single resistance force was allowed to liberate the Golan, Syrian-occupied territory, from the Syrian territory. This is very important to understand. And when the Syrian revolution started in 2011, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, the richest man in Syria, Rami Makhlouf, and again, if you want to make a link between authoritarianism and neoliberalism, just take, I think it was The Economist in February 2011, saying how Rami Makhlouf was a successful businessman, not because he was linked to Bashar al-Assad, not just because he was maybe so intelligent. So again, you see the link between neoliberalism and dictatorship. Bref, in 2011 April, he made a very interesting interview saying that if Assad regime would fall, Israel would never know stability in the future. This was a clear message sent that Assad regime protects the borders of Israel. And this has been constant until now even. There's various reports of Israeli officials saying, basically, we want to keep the Assad regime because this border has been secured for 4 decades. And we're very happy with a weak Assad regime. This is perfect for us. Other example of Assad regime collaboration with various imperialism. And again, when we speak about imperialism, we shouldn't limit it to one single actor. Imperialism is not an actor, it's a system where various imperialist forces struggle and combat each other, but can also make agreement. So, Assad regime, for example, collaborated in '91 with the USA in the war against Iraq. They destroyed the country and started a period of sanctions, deadly sanctions. After the 2001 September terrorist attack, the Assad regime participated and collaborated with the Bush government in the war on terror, etc. In 2008, Assad was invited to the Élysée Palais to see Sarkozy, also well known as a very good anti-imperialist personality, obviously. It's ironic, huh? And etc. In the first weeks of the revolution, in 2011, Hillary Clinton said of Bashar al-Assad he was a reformist. Other example, and actually USA never sought regime change in Syria. It has been a constant position that we want to maintain the regime as it is with superficial change. And this has been confirmed until today, and we'll come back to this. Regarding again the Palestinian issue, since the beginning of the Syrian revolution, the Palestinians were accused since the first week in the Syrian revolution the blame was put on them. Sectarian problems in Latakia, it was the fault of the Palestinians. Problems in Damascus, it was the Palestinians. Dar'a, it was the Palestinians. You had several refugee camps throughout Syria that were bombed by the Assad regime. Yarmouk camp suffered a deadly siege blockades for nearly than 2 years. More than 150 people died of starvation. You have thousands of people that were killed, Palestinians that were killed or arrested by the Assad regime. Today, you have more than 20,000 Palestinians that are wanted by the security services of the Assad regime. This regime has nothing to do with anti-imperialism, just on the opposite. And the so-called new war on terror starting against Daesh, Assad regime has been said a few times that he's ready to collaborate with any kind of foreign forces. My second point, when it said Israel position towards the various Arab revolution, the best statement that was made by Israel, you want to note its position, was by Avigdor Lieberman in 2012, April, saying for Egypt that post-revolutionary Egypt is a bigger threat to Israel than Iran. Obviously, the worst thing for Israel is popular uprisings in the region. This is the worst threat for Israel. It's not a so-called authoritarian regime that is using the card of Palestine to further its regional influence in the region. Whether Iran, whether Saudi Arabia, whether Turkey and Syria, they are all enemies of the Palestinian liberation. This should be very well understood. And this is the position of Israel, that these uprisings are the biggest threat to Israel. To give you an example, for the first times in decades maybe, you had mobilization of Palestinian refugees in all the countries neighboring 48 Palestine, Israel. In Lebanon, you had walks in 2011 towards the border. In Syria, it was used by the regime, and after this there was a whole story. I won't go in detail, but we can come back. In Jordan, Egypt, etc., you had a new wave of demonstration and mobilization among Palestinian refugees in neighboring countries. And it was important to bring back the issue of Palestinian refugees in the Palestinian liberation. This is a key issue. Again, you saw a lot during the Syrian revolution, the solidarity of Syrian revolutionaries with Palestine. For example, you had demonstrations calling for the name of calling for Palestine liberation during the Gaza attacks in 2012 November and in 2014 summer as well, saying the road to the liberation of Palestine goes through Damascus. And in the beginning of the demonstrations in Daraa, when Maher al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad, was sending its troops to Daraa, the protesters were saying, "Yeah, dog, send your army to the land instead of killing your own people." And the Syrian youth rate was built on all aspects. For example, there was a campaign that was launched against a Syrian opposition member called Kamal Lobwani that just came back to Israel a few days before to seek the support of Israel. This was refused by all the Syrians, and a declaration statement was made by the Free Golan revolutionaries to refuse this kind of behavior. This must be clear. Israel is an enemy of this revolution, and the best enemy of Israel is the popular uprising, because the liberation of the Palestinian people go through the overthrow of all the regime in the regions. This must be very clear. And this has been one of the biggest mistakes, not only of the Syrian National Liberation Movement leadership, if you want, even though the coalition is not really what I would call representative of the Syrian street, or the Palestinian Liberation leadership, or the Kurdish leadership. It's that they seeked coalition with authoritarian states instead of seeking solidarity with people from below in the various uprisings. And we can come back this in the questions. Finally, on the popular organization still organizing on the ground. You had still pockets of hope in Syria fighting for the original objectives of the revolution, for democracy, social justice, and against sectarianism. And we should remember that in Syria we had the highest level of self-organization of the people in the whole Middle East and North Africa revolution processes. Simply because, and it's not saying this, I'm chauvinist at all, it's just because the state completely disappeared from regions. And I can cite a lot of examples of local councils that used to govern their society from A to Z. And Raqqa during 6 months in 2013 was an example of self-organization. And Aleppo today is the best example of popular resistance from below. People are organizing today through their local council against the offensive to Assad regime and its allies. The local council of Free Aleppo established a center of crisis to provide bread to the people, essential goods, fuel. They paid the various popular organization, the civil defense, people, bakeries, to have enough of organization to sustain any kind of future siege. And we have to understand that why is the Assad regime always bombing free neighborhoods of Syria, meaning governed by democratic council? The worst enemy of the Assad regime is democratic organization. This is the worst enemy. They don't want any kind of alternative to the Assad regime. This is why the bombing has been constantly concentrating in these kind of areas such as Aleppo and others, and not on areas controlled by Daesh. The best enemy for Assad is Daesh. We have to understand this. And this is why actually, we won't come back, but the Assad regime let develop all these various Islamic fundamentalist forces in the beginning of the revolution while repressing civil democrats, etc. Last example of few democratic self-organization from below. In the past few days in the Rif Idlib countryside, people organized a campaign and saying no to nepotism. And this is in liberated areas to say that the most accomplished people should be able to self-govern and not relationship, etc. Like clientelism, like the old way of doing with the Assad regime. You had campaigns of women empowerment in various areas of Syria, did also by popular organization on the ground. And many other examples that it continues until today. In conclusion, we have to understand that above and going above, I mean, geopolitical analysis, our first understanding of uprising must be our solidarity with people from below and solidarity with the demands for freedom and dignity. And it's not a question about what's foreign policy. It is important. Really, it is key to put our analysis and solidarity with people on the ground struggling for the original objectives of the revolution. And today there's so many similarities between the Palestinians and Syrians. We're witnessing today in Syria a form of new Oslo. Geneva Free is a form of new Oslo. You have the whole region, the whole world, pushing the Syrians to accept a peace agreement, saying basically, you suffered more than 400,000 martyrs. More than half of the population is displaced, internally or externally. For what? To the stability of the imperialist system and to maintain Assad regime. This is typically what happened in Oslo in '93, and which is continuing until today, to say to the Palestinians, go into negotiation, submit yourself, accept everything, but our most important thing is stability for Israel and the imperialist system. This is what is happening with the Syrians. So today, again and again, we have to say that the destiny of the Syrian people is linked to the Palestinian, just as it is linked with the Kurdish. And I totally agree that the solution is regional and based on the liberation of all the people of the region. Thank you very much.
I know we got started a little bit late, but we still have one more speaker.
Thank you so much. Actually, after what has been said by Yasser and Joseph, nothing left. I might highlight something that Actually, it's very hard to talk about Palestine without linking the movement of the Palestinian liberation with the Syrian, with Syria, especially with Hafez al-Assad. In 2002, when Yasser Arafat was under siege, some of his friends who were with him, he told them, "This is what Hafez al-Assad brought to us. We are in this situation because of Hafez al-Assad." If you want to, I'll go through what Yasser and Joseph said and highlight a few things. It's real that since Hafez al-Assad came to the power in Syria, the situation of the Palestinian movement became worse. Actually, before, when he was the chief of I think the Air Force in Syria, he arrested a lot of the Palestinian liberation movement. He arrested Yasser Arafat Abu Ammar in 1969 in Manbij prison, actually, and a lot of mediation happened to release him. And in 1970, when King Hussein did the massacres against Palestinians in Jordan, Hafez al-Assad did not use the Air Force because he was told directly by Israelis that you cannot use the Air Force in Jordan. In 1976, when Hafez al-Assad made Tel al-Za'atar, destroyed Tel al-Za'atar completely, removed it completely from the existence, killed more than 3,000. Actually, not only Kata'ib were there, even some parts of the Syrian army brigades were there and contributed to this massacre. And in between 1982 and 1989, maybe it's very famous, the Camps War in Lebanon. Hafez al-Assad supported a lot Hezbollah and Amal in sieging the camps in Lebanon. Actually, so in all, even in 1991, when Yasser Arafat signed Oslo Accords, there was no other solution but to go through this political. I mean, in general, it's on all along the way of the Palestinian movement. Hafez al-Assad was linked to it, and actually it happened. It became a very personal between Hafez al-Assad and Yasser Arafat at the end. Regarding Palestinians in Syria, actually there was a very high percentage. Actually, before that, Yasser highlighted that there was a Palestine branch in Syria. It's a security branch. It's in one of the wars where thousands and thousands of Syrians and Palestinians were killed in this branch. And actually, it's not for Palestinians only. There was a whole branch only for Palestinians. It's called Al-Dabt al-Fidaiya. Now, even in English, it doesn't have a translation. It's only for Palestinians, just to deal with the Palestinian factions who are either pro or anti the Syrian regime. This history between Palestinians and not only the Syrian regime, with all the Arab regimes, because all the Arab regimes use the Palestinian name just to control their countries, okay, and use the Palestinians just to find argument that we need, that the Palestinian cause is the main, and we don't have any choice just to work on the Palestinian issue. But if, in more than 40 years they did nothing, just destroyed Palestinians. What happened? In Lebanon, between 1973 and 1989, almost all the Palestinian camps were destroyed. And moreover, the economic and social rights for Palestinians are not even exist in Lebanon. You cannot work. If you go to the camps in Lebanon, you find doctors, professors, high qualified people. They cannot work because they need a permission, and they cannot get this permission to work in Lebanon. And about 400,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon in the camps. In Syria, maybe in Syria, Syria was the only country where Palestinian refugees had social and economic rights similar to the Syrians, but it was not a gift from Hafez al-Assad. It was a decision from the Arab League right after Al-Nakba in 1948 that Syria will host these Palestinians, and actually the Syrian governments from 1948 until now, they are getting paid for Palestinians by the Arab League and by the United Nations. In Jordan, what happened in 1970s is horrible, and it's not even like well documented and known for all. Now in the current situation in Syria there are about 12 camps across the country. In Dar'a, the camp completely destroyed. Yarmouk camp, as Joseph mentioned, completely besieged, and about 150,000 Palestinians used to live in this camp. Completely they are out now. Only 2,000 to 3,000 are left inside the camp, and they are almost all the elders who were born in Palestine and refused to live another Nakba. And going to the north, in two camps in north, An-Narab and Handarat, completely destroyed, and there is no single person living there. And until now, the regime is shelling and dropping barrel bombs on Handarat camp for no reason, just completely for no reason. So in general, why we are interested in the camps in Syria? The refugee cause of Palestinians has three elements: the camps and UNRWA and Al-Nakba. Camps is the only proof that this Nakba was happened, and UNRWA is the second proof that because they are serving these camps. So now there are no camps in Syria to be served by UNRWA, and so that UNRWA is decreasing their support for Palestinian refugees in Syria. Going back to the Syrian situation, actually, what I've learned from the Syrian revolution that the reality is right behind the scene we watch on CNN, BBC, or NBC or any other channel. What's going on the ground is really different than what we see. We can go through a lot of theories analyzing what is going on in Syria, but simply if I want to make it simple, the Syrian structure, the Syrian social structure, in all its systems, the economic and the political and the social systems were all destroyed by Hafez al-Assad and continued destroyed by Bashar al-Assad. On the economic level, right before 2011, the poverty was increased during Bashar al-Assad's control, and especially in rurals. There is an area in the northeast of Syria. We call it the food basket of Syria. It's called Al Jazeera. It's between Al Furat and Al Iraq. It was completely destroyed by Bashar al-Assad and the farms until I remember between 2006 and 2010, more than 500,000 of people, the residents of these areas were displaced across Syria, and actually there were camps built for them. And if we go to the rurals of Damascus, where a lot of industries were going on there, actually their industries were destroyed. And Bashar al-Assad, what he did, he brought the trade instead and developed it just to benefit his family, like Al-Makhluf family and Assad family and some of the people around him. But this affected the other classes in the Syrian society to the extent where the middle class in Syria was about really to be removed. And a lot of businessmen became really like broken, and especially around in rural Damascus, where a lot of furniture and industries were going on, like literally between 2009 and 2011, they had nothing to work. So that we saw when the demonstrations and protests started in Syria, started in these rurals, and then moved to across the country, and the last one was Aleppo. Regarding the relation between Al-Assad, the father and the son, and Israel, actually it was very good relation, and there was connections. Just 2 days ago, I had a meeting with the EU embassies in DC, and one of the attendees was a diplomat, a former diplomat in the Syrian embassy in Damascus, in DC, and he was responsible for the fight of the relation between Syria and Israel. What he was telling that in April or May 2011, like right after the starting of the Syrian revolution, Bashar al-Assad sent a message to Bibi Netanyahu through a very famous businessman here in New York, asking him to mediate with the Americans to decrease the pressure on his government and on Bashar al-Assad, and Netanyahu refused at that time. Right after that happened, Bashar al-Assad suddenly opened the borders to Jolan and allowed thousands of Palestinians to go to and demonstrate on the borders. And it happened another time in June, and also Netanyahu refused to help Bashar al-Assad at that time because there was like kind of imagination that Bashar al-Assad will go in. But I'm telling you that by July 2012, all the international community took a decision to keep Bashar al-Assad. Right after, like, I remember that I was still in Lebanon, and there was a trip Abu Mazen made to Russia, and right after he came back, he went to Lebanon and met all the Palestinian ambassadors in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and part of the Palestinian faction leaders, and told them that Bashar al-Assad will stay. Russians will not allow Bashar al-Assad to go. And from that time, all the way the PLO used to deal with the Syrian with Bashar al-Assad have been changed. Before 2011, the PLO and PLA were very big supportive for the Syrian opposition. Even a lot of the Syrian opposition people have Palestinian passports and diplomat passports just to travel around. After that, we saw that Abu Mazen and PLO became very close friends to Bashar al-Assad, and actually this affected a lot the Palestinian refugees in Syria, and there was no prize for this. I mean, until now, PLO is not able to release one single Palestinian was arrested by Bashar al-Assad. They could not they cannot convince like an officer in the Syrian security branch to release Palestinian. One Palestinian was released. About 3,000 Palestinians were arrested until in Syria during during the revolution, and more than 4,000 were killed, and some of them were arrested and tortured to death inside al-Assad prisons. Actually, I don't want to take a lot more time, and because Yasser and Joseph covered a lot. But what I would say that. Even now, if al-Assad is winning and taking a lot of land back, and from the south to the north, it's not because he is strong. Actually, now in Syria there is no regime. There are regimes in Syria. There are like the security is a regime by itself. Hezbollah is a regime by itself. The Iraqi militias are regimes by themselves. So there is no one regime in Syria now, but al-Assad and his alliance are winning because the silence of the international community, and because the support of Russia. But despite this, I'm saying that what is going on now is just like a phase of the Syrian revolution. Even if al-Assad stayed now in power for maybe 10 or 20 or another 40 years, there will come a day he will leave, because this is the history, and this is what we learn from the history. Dictators will not stay, and they will be removed in a way or another. Thank you so much.